branch, and we are going to...
Sorry, Jonas, just to say 1-0 Neymar.
First things first, obviously. Game is not over yet, so please pay attention to the presentation. I know it's hard, I know it's difficult. I like football as well, I completely understand you. Finland is still not in the games, unfortunately, but maybe one day. Okay, so during the opening session of this seminar, we heard several times about the importance of the MRV system in CORSIA. And this is the most urgent task operators and states will need to implement when it comes to the CORSIA implementation. So that's why the objective of this seminar is mainly focused on the MRV system, on monitoring, reporting, and verification, because that is really the most important thing as of now, once we are approaching 1st of January 2019 and the start of the monitoring requirements for CO2 emissions. I can't highlight enough the importance of the MRV system. As it was already mentioned, we are 1 day less of 6 months from the start of the monitoring requirement. So on an ICAO scale, that is a very limited time period. It's like a blink of the eye. So we really need to ensure that all the operators performing international flights are ready to start the monitoring. Their administrative states are ready to guide the operators, to instruct them how to make the collection of CO2 emissions happen starting from next year. I think most of you are already familiar with the components of the MRV system, but as a repetition, what do we mean when we are talking about MRV? Well, M stands for monitoring of fuel use in order to calculate the CO2 emissions. Monitoring, it might sound a little bit weird, but at least for me, it basically means collection of fuel use information. So this is continuous activity. It's done by the operator. The operator knows its operational portfolio best, and the operator is collecting information about the fuel burn, about the CO2 emissions on a continuous basis. R in the MRV system stands from reporting. So every year there will be a compilation of the information that has been monitored throughout the year, and this information will be reported first from the operator to the state, and then from the state to ICAO, so that ICAO can calculate the sector's growth factor and perform all the other necessary calculations for the CORSIA implementation. And the last element in the MRV system, not the least element, stands from V, and that is verification. So we want to ensure that the CO2 information that flows into the MRV system is robust, it's reliable, and that's why the SARPs include a requirement for verification of the CO2 emissions information before this information gets reported. So we want to ensure that everything is correct when it comes to CO2 emissions reporting. I already mentioned that the sequence of M, R, and V is slightly different. And here we try to illustrate the annual cycle of the MRV system. So I will talk a lot more about emissions monitoring plan just in a second, but everything starts with the emissions monitoring plan. So airplane operator will draft an emissions monitoring plan, submit the plan to the state. State will approve the plan, and this is really the starting point of the monitoring for the CO2 emissions information. The monitoring needs to happen in accordance with the plan, and the plan needs to be approved by the state before the monitoring will commence. Once the operator has the emissions monitoring plan in place, there will be the monitoring of CO2 emissions throughout the year. So every time an operator performs an international flight, that flight will be captured in accordance with the emissions monitoring plan. Fuel burn will be monitored, CO2 emissions will be calculated. And this is really continuous action that happens and takes place throughout the year, continuous action. There will be draft emissions report once a year. So always following the monitoring of a full calendar year, the operator can compile the emissions information from that year into a report. So this report compiles CO2 information from one calendar year. There will be verification of this emissions report, so third-party verifier or an external verifier, as you wish, someone who is independent from the airplane operator, checks the emissions report and corrects and makes sure that everything is reported in a correct manner in that emissions report. Once the emissions report has been finalized and verified, the operator will submit this emissions report to the state. And state will have a role in reviewing the annual emissions report from the operator. Yes, there is a verification involved before reporting, but state also has a role in confirming that all the information is correct in the emissions report. And finally, as I already mentioned, the state will report compiled information about the CO2 emissions to ICAO in order for ICAO to calculate the necessary calculations as described in the CORSIA SARPs. In short, that's the annual cycle of MRV. In this presentation, we will focus on the monitoring part of the MRV system. So M is basically covered by this presentation. R and V will follow later on today in the afternoon. We will have a separate presentation about those items. When it comes to the SARPs that were approved or adopted by the ICAO Council last week, the MRV requirements are included in Chapter 2 of the standard. So everything we will be showing today is basically based on the requirements, the standards, and recommended practices in Chapter 2 of Annex 16, Volume 4. Let's start with the applicability. So applicability question is always important. And there were already questions about the applicability during this morning, so I think it's good to make this clear. So there are two different applicabilities. There's the applicability of the MRV requirements, so collection of CO2 information, reporting of this information, and verification. And that applies to all international traffic. So all international flights are covered by the MRV rules of CORSIA. Then there's the other applicability that relates to offsetting. So that applicability only starts from 2021 onwards, once the pilot phase of CORSIA kicks in. And for example, the information regarding the states that will voluntarily participate in CORSIA offsetting will only be relevant starting from 2021 onwards. So 2019 and 20 applicability is the MRV applicability. And as already mentioned, the applicability of the MRV excludes certain kind of aircraft. So if the aircraft is less than 5,700 kilos of maximum certificated takeoff mass, it's excluded. So no need to monitor CO2 emissions from small airplanes. Humanitarian, medical, firefighting operations are excluded. So this gives some relief for operators that are performing humanitarian, medical, or firefighting operations. And also, smaller operators are excluded from the MRV applicability. So if the operator produces less than or equal of 10,000 tons of CO2 on an annual basis, there's no need to do MRV for that operator. So small operators do not need to monitor their CO2 emissions under CORSIA. This is basically what I just said, but it's important to repeat the different applicabilities. So if you remember one thing from this presentation, it's this slide. Two different applicabilities. Applicability of MRV and applicability of the offsetting requirements. And the most crucial thing to note here is that the applicability of MRV requirements starts on 1st of January 2019. So very soon, the operators will need to start monitoring CO2 emissions. Offsetting, whereas it's interesting, it will follow later on, but we will start with the monitoring of CO2 emissions. It's easy to tell you that, okay, monitoring will start 1st of January 2019. We keep on repeating that. But what does it actually mean? What exactly do the operators and states need to do in order to make the monitoring happening from that date onwards? Of course, planning is always a key aspect in life and in all kinds of projects you are doing. And also for monitoring of CO2 emissions, the experts who have been drafting the SARPs and the requirements that have now been adopted by the ICAO Council, they thought that proper planning of monitoring is important. So they came up with the concept of emissions monitoring plan. And we will now have a look to the emissions monitoring plan, what it is, what kind of elements are included in the emissions monitoring plan, and when should the emissions monitoring plan be drafted and approved by the state. So the idea of the emissions monitoring plan is quite simple. First of all, it's drafted by the airplane operator. So the action to draft an emissions monitoring plan is really on the airplane operator. This is because the emissions monitoring plan will include specific information that only the operator has access to. So the operator will tell in the emissions monitoring plan to the state how that operator will approach the monitoring of the CO2 emissions information. We want to highlight the communicative nature of the emissions monitoring plan. It should not be only a document drafted by the operator and then thrown to the state and then forgotten. No, that's not what the emissions monitoring plan is. The emissions monitoring plan should facilitate dialogue, discussion, communication between the operator and the administering state, so that each operator identifies an appropriate method for monitoring the CO2 emissions. Having said that, the roles are clear. So the operator will draft the emissions monitoring plan. There is a responsibility for the state to approve the emissions monitoring plan and the contents of the plan. So everything starts with operator preparing and submitting an emissions monitoring plan to the state. There is a recommendation, and this is a recommendation, for the operator to submit the emissions monitoring plan by 30th of September this year. So as you remember, monitoring of CO2 emissions will start 1st of January 2019, and ideally the plan would be in place before that date in order for the operator to start monitoring CO2 emissions in an efficient way. There is a mandatory time frame for the operator to submit the emissions monitoring plan by end of February 2019. So in this kind of case, you will see that the monitoring itself needs to start before the operator has submitted an emissions monitoring plan. That's not ideal situation, but can happen, and that's why the standard has provisions in place for this kind of cases. When it comes to the approval of the emissions monitoring plan, it is recommended that the state approves the monitoring plan by end of November this year. So this would allow the operator to really start monitoring CO2 emissions beginning of 2019 based on an approved emissions monitoring plan. If this is not possible, there is a mandatory time frame for the state to approve the emissions monitoring plan by 30th of April 2019. And finally, what happens after the emissions monitoring plan has been approved? It will not get forgotten. The operator will, of course, start monitoring in accordance with the plan. But also, if there are updates, if there are revisions, if there are changes to the operator's fleet, for example, the emissions monitoring plan needs to be updated. So if there are changes, the operator will need to update the emissions monitoring plan and communicate the updates to the state for state's review, and in some cases for state's approval. Let's dive into the contents of an emissions monitoring plan. So far, it has been pretty abstract. Okay, it's a plan, and everyone has an idea of a plan. But let's see what this particular plan includes. There are basically four main elements in the emissions monitoring plan, and we will have a closer look to each of the elements. But the first element is airplane operator identification. So the operator basically identifies itself, tells who are responsible inside of the operator when it comes to emissions monitoring plan and so forth. The second part is fleet and operations data, where the operator tells to the state what kind of airplane the operator is operating, what is the operational structure of that specific airline. The third part is the section where the operator communicates to the state which are the methods for that operator to monitor fuel use and to calculate CO2 emissions out of the fuel use information. And the last part of the emissions monitoring plan is about data management. So once the monitoring of CO2 emissions has been performed, how the operator will manage this information, who has access to this information inside of the operator, who controls the information, and also how to communicate changes in the emissions monitoring plan to the state, which is very important part of this element. The more specific requirements and contents for each of the sections are included in Appendix 4 of the Annex 16, Volume 4. So the first section of the emissions monitoring plan, airplane operator identification. This is quite crucial because the state needs to know who is the operator the state is administering under CORSIA. So obviously, this section of the monitoring plan will include information such as name of the operator, ownership structure of the operator, contact information, who is the CORSIA focal point inside of that operator that the state can always contact if the state has questions, and also a short description of the activities for the operator. One key piece of information here is also the attribution of the operator to the state. And this was already addressed during the first part of the seminar earlier this morning, but the operator needs to identify the administering state for that particular operator. And the standard outlines rules for this. So the operator can use information from ICAO designator. So if the operator has an ICAO designator attributed to it, then the state who has notified the ICAO designator to ICAO shall be the administering state for that particular operator. If there is no ICAO designator for the operator, then AOC, or the Air Operator Certificate, will be used for the purposes of attribution. So if the operator has an AOC that has been issued by a particular state, then that state will be the administering state for CORSIA as well. If there's no ICAO designator or AOC, then the place of juridical registration will be used for this attribution. Second main section of the emissions monitoring plan is with respect of fleet and operations data. So this section is quite interesting because the operator outlines the aircraft. There's something called fleet declaration that the operator fills in. So this declaration includes all the airplane types that the operator is operating, the fuel types, and the number of airplane. So this is for the state to gain information about the magnitude of operations for that particular operation. Key piece of information will also be the flight attribution to the operator. So once there is an international flight, we need to make sure that each of these international flights are being attributed to a single airplane operator. So for this purpose, information such as ICAO designator or the registration mark for the airplane that has been used for the flight will be used. If this information is not available, then the aircraft owner will be the airplane operator for that particular flight. In this section of the monitoring plan, the operator will also indicate provisional information about its operations. So the operator will indicate the list of state pairs that the operator is operating at the time of submission of the emissions monitoring plan. We need to remember that this is a plan, so operations can change, of course. So the operator introduces new routes to its portfolio or network. This would obviously mean that the list of state pairs will change. But this is just the initial information for the state to get an idea about the operational network of that operator. Also, we need to be mindful of the exemptions. So you remember there are various technical exemptions, for example, those humanitarian, medical and firefighting flights. And this is the section of the emissions monitoring plan where the operator will tell to the state how it will filter out these operations from emissions monitoring. So it's important to make sure that there are no flights covered by the MRV that should not be there, and also that all the flights that are covered by the MRV requirements are really captured in the operator's emissions monitoring plan. The third part of the emissions monitoring plan consists of methods and means for calculation of CO2 emissions from international flights. And this is probably the most CORSIA-specific section of the emissions monitoring plan. Information like identification or operations and fleet, that's already there in the operator. Operator knows its fleet. Operator knows its responsible personnel, for example. But the emissions monitoring options, this is something where the operator needs to make a CORSIA-specific decisions and choices. So here, the operator will choose one of the monitoring options. We will go to the monitoring options later on, but CORSIA provides a wide range of options for an operator to pick one that best fits its operational structure. And this is the section in the emissions monitoring plan where the operator will tell to the state what is the method of monitoring fuel use and calculation of and to calculate the CO2 emissions based on the fuel use. I told you that there are various options for the monitoring, and you might wonder how to pick one of those options or how to instruct the operator if the operator asks the state, what should I do in terms of monitoring? What is the appropriate monitoring option for that particular operator? You might notice that we have leaflets at the ICAO booth, and one of those leaflets, I believe it's the number 3, includes this very same decision tree that I'm going to show now. So how to determine an appropriate monitoring method for an operator. The operator, of course, they have flexibility how to do this, but one way of doing it is to collect information on all international flights per 1 calendar year for that operator. So very simple exercise, take all your international flights. There will be something called ICAO CORSIA CERT, ICAO CORSIA CO2 estimation and reporting tool. We will have a specific session in this seminar dedicated to the ICAO CORSIA CERT. So you will hear a lot about this tool later on during the seminar. But here I just want to mention that ICAO has developed a simplified tool for the estimation and reporting of emissions. And this tool can be used for a preliminary assessment of the CO2 emissions for a specific airplane operator. So the operator can insert all international flights to the ICAO CORSIA CERT, and the ICAO CORSIA CERT will estimate CO2 emissions for that operator. As you remember, if the operator is small enough, if it's below 10,000 tons of CO2 emissions on an annual basis, there is no compliance requirement for that operator. So that's the end of the decision tree for those operators. No need to do monitoring under CORSIA. However, if the operator has more than 10,000 tons of CO2 emissions on an annual basis, based on the estimation provided by the ICAO CERT, there is another decision point that the operator needs to make. And that is with respect of a threshold of 500,000 tons of CO2 on an annual basis. So the CORSIA SARPS foresees a threshold of 500,000 tons of CO2 on an annual basis as an eligibility threshold for operators to use the ICAO CORSIA CERT for compliance purposes. So let me be clear here. The CERT, all the operators can use CERT for an estimation of the CO2 emissions. All the operators can use CERT for that. But only those operators that are below 500,000 tons of CO2 based on the estimation of the CERT, they can also use CERT for compliance purposes. So CERT will include an automatic reporting functionality, and these operators can use the automatic functionality when it comes to CO2 emissions reporting. And those operators that are above the 500,000 tons threshold, they cannot use CERT because these are large operators, and the SARPs outline a requirement for large operators to monitor their actual fuel use. So CERT is an estimation tool that can be used by certain operators, but for these big operators, there needs to be information collected from the real fuel use of that operator. And for that purposes, the SARPs include 5 different methods. So the methods are listed over there. We will have a closer look to all of the 5 methods later on. But the idea of having 5 different methods for fuel use monitoring is to allow flexibility to operators to choose one of the methods that best fits that operator's procedures. So there might be operators that are already monitoring fuel use based on some of the methods, and in these kind of cases, it's very easy for those operators to choose one monitoring method for CORSIA purposes. The threshold of 500,000 tons is a bit tricky one because it's a very justified question. How do you know your emissions before the applicability of the CORSIA? So the operator needs to estimate the level of CO2 emissions even before this requirement starts to apply to that operator. So one could also argue that, okay, in 2019, the operator is below the threshold, whereas in 2020, in the next year, it will go above the threshold. What should we do in these kind of cases? The SARPs, the Annex 16, Volume 4, includes provisions for this kind of cases. So if there are changes to the level of CO2 emissions from the operator, for example, there's an option, there's a possibility for the operator to continue using the cert in 2020 if its emissions go beyond the threshold of 500,000 tons in that year, although the emissions have been below the threshold in 2019. So the drafters of the SARPs have really thought through all the possible scenarios in cases of either decrease or increase of the emissions and what kind of consequences these changes have for the monitoring methods for a particular airline. As already mentioned, ICAO CORSIA CERT, it's an estimation tool that some of the operators can use for the compliance purposes for the CORSIA MRV system. All the operators can use CERT to estimate their level of CO2 emissions. The CERT will be available on ICAO's webpage, free of charge, most likely during the month of July 2018. So the CERT was just approved by the Council, and the tool will be made available on the ICAO website. You might wonder how the CERT looks like. Well, I have good news for you. There will be a dedicated session to the CORSIA CERT after the lunch break. We will have our CERT experts illustrating and demonstrating the tool, so you will really see how the tool will work, what kind of information will be included in the tool, and what kind of information the tool will provide to the user. But let's have a look to the 5 monitoring methods. Here I want to highlight that the smaller operators that are below the threshold I just mentioned, they can use CERT. It's completely fine for them to use the CERT tool for the monitoring purposes. But these small operators, they can also use the fuel use monitoring methods. So for the smaller operators, there's no limitation. They can either use the CERT or then they can pick one of these fuel use monitoring methods for CORSIA purposes. But for the larger operators that are above the threshold, which is 500,000 tons for the beginning of the CORSIA in 2019 and 20, they need to pick one of these 5 fuel monitoring methods. And as mentioned, there are 5 methods because there needs to be flexibility for the operator to choose an appropriate method for that operator in order to make the monitoring of CO2 emissions as efficient as possible. The specifics of all these 5 methods are outlined in Appendix 2 of the Annex 16, Volume 4. So you can always go to the Appendix 2 and check the details of the monitoring methods. It should also be noted that all of these methods, there are 5 methods, but they are equal. There's no hierarchy between the methods. The experts have assessed each of these methods, and they have come up in a resolution that all of the 5 methods are within certain ranges of accuracy. So it shouldn't make a big difference in terms of accuracy of the CO2 emissions, whether the operator uses method A or fuel uplift methods. So these are really equal methods for the operator to choose from. And the last thing that should be noted here is that the operator has a flexibility to apply different fuel use monitoring methods to different airplane types within that operator. So if the operator has, for example, 2 different airplane types, the operator can apply different methods for each of these airplane types. Because some of the airplane types might use different procedures than others. Some of them might be more modern, more automatic reporting than older airplane types. So that's why it's important that the operator has flexibility to pick monitoring method for each of the airplane types. The main difference between the 5 methods is the point or the data point when the measurement of fuel use will be made. There are different fuel measurement points throughout the operation of an airplane. So for example, the first fuel measurement point here, it's called block on. So I think some of you might be familiar with the concept of block on, but in this context, it means the time when an airplane finally stops at the end of the flight. So usually when the airplane arrives to the gate, switches off the engines, that's the measurement point block on for CORSIA purposes. The second point here you will see is fuel uplift. So this is very simply the amount of fuel that has been uplifted to the airplane before the flight under consideration. So this information usually comes from the fuel provider, which supplies the fuel to the airplane at the airport. The measurement point C is called fuel in tanks after fuel uplift. So this is the moment of time immediately after the fuel uplift for the airplane has been completed. So fuel comes to the airplane, and once the uplift is completed, that is the measurement point we are talking about here. You will also see that there is a measurement point D, which is called block off. So this is the time when an airplane first moves for the purpose of taking off. So airplane leaves the gate, turns on the engines. This is usually the measurement point block off. So you will see there are multiple measurement points that are possible, and these 5 methods, they are using all of these measurement points that I just mentioned. So all the green highlighted measurement points on the screen will be used by at least one of the 5 fuel monitoring methods. So the first one, method A. This method uses information that is being collected from fuel in tanks after the fuel uplift. So you will see we will take the fuel in tanks after the fuel uplift before the flight under consideration. So this is when the airplane is preparing to start the international flight that we are now measuring. And the second measurement point is fuel in tanks after fuel uplift for the subsequent flight. So you can see that it's not only the one single flight that we are measuring here or data points related to that one single flight. For some of the methods, like this method A here, they require information from the flight under consideration, but also some information from the previous flight. So this is trying to ensure that the tracking of the fuel stays consistent throughout the operation of an airplane. And for the purposes of method A, the operator also needs information regarding the fuel uplift for the following flight. So we have the flight under consideration, we have fuel uplift information for that flight and for the subsequent flight, and then we need information of the fuel uplift for the subsequent flight. And the formula is shown there on the screen. I also suggest to consult with Appendix 2 of the SARPs once the SARPs are available for the formulas for each of these methods. So method A, fuel uplift after fuel, fuel in tanks after fuel uplift. The method B looks very similar, and the similarity is that this method also uses information from 2 flights. So here you can see we are applying fuel measurement point A, which is fuel at block on. So once the airplane arrives to the airport, comes to the gate, there is the block on time. We will apply fuel uplift for that flight. So airplane lands, block on, fuel uplift for that same airplane. And then the airplane again departs for the flight under consideration here and lands to the destination airport and arrives to gate at the destination airport where we have another block on measurement point. And you will also see the formula for the calculation there on the screen. Very similar to method A, but method B uses the information from block on instead of after the fuel uplift. The third method, this is called block off, block on. And in order to apply this method, the operator needs information from 2 measurement points. So the first one is fuel at block off. So once the airplane leaves the gate, turns on the engines for the flight under consideration. That's the first measurement point. The second measurement point is, again, once the operator arrives to the destination airport, arrives to the gate, switches off the engines. This is the second measurement point. Calculation, as you can see, is a little bit more simple than for the previous measurement fuel measurement methods. The fourth one is called fuel uplift. This, very simply, uses the fuel uplift information for the flight under consideration. So once the airplane prepares for its flight, there will be fuel uplift for that flight, and the amount of fuel uplift is really considered as the fuel burn for that flight under consideration. Formula to apply this method is very simple. It's only the fuel uplift for the flight. And the last of the 5 methods, it's called block hour method. So this might seem a little bit more complicated, but it's not so complicated, in fact. In order to apply this method, the operator will calculate a fuel burn ratio for its fleet, and more specifically for each airplane type inside of the fleet of that operator. So the operator will basically calculate how much fuel per hour certain airplane type consumes within that operator's fleet. Once this information is available, the operator will multiply the average fuel burn ratio that was calculated for each of the airplane types within the fleet with the block hours flown by those airplanes. So first, calculation of average fuel burn ratio per airplane type, and then multiplying this average ratio by the block time. So basically the flight time for each of the airplane types. So five different methods, 5 different ways of applying different data measurement points, but also 5 different options for the operator to find the most appropriate method for the monitoring of CO2 emissions for that specific operator. As I mentioned, some of the methods require information regarding fuel uplift, for example. And usually this information is provided in the quantity of volume. So what we are interested in CORSIA is the mass of fuel use, so that we can calculate the mass of CO2 emissions based on the fuel use. So in CORSIA, we are interested of the mass, and when there is a fuel monitoring method that requires monitoring or collection of information based on volume, for example, there are provisions for converting the volume into the mass of fuel. So the operator can either apply a standard value for the fuel density. So the standard value is 0.8 kilograms per liter. Or if the operator has access to the actual fuel density values, the operator should use these actual fuel density values. But there's basically a choice between using a standard value or an actual fuel density value in order to convert the volume of fuel into the mass of fuel. And this method will also be included in the emissions monitoring plan. So the operator will propose in the monitoring plan to the state what is its approach when it comes to fuel density, and the state will then review the approach and also approve what is the method for fuel density values for that operator. We are still within the contents of the emissions monitoring plan. The third part was just a little bit more lengthy than the other parts in this presentation because I wanted to describe the differences in the fuel monitoring options so that everyone is clear what are the possibilities for the operators in terms of fuel monitoring. The last part of the emissions monitoring plan is about the data management, data flow, and data control. So here, once the CO2 emissions are known, once the monitoring has been done, the operator describes the internal roles, the responsibilities, and the procedures within that operator when it comes to data management. The operator is also invited to elaborate on the risks that are related to the data management system. So first of all, the operator will describe how the data will be managed, but also what kind of risks are involved in these procedures that are being described in the emissions monitoring plan. Again, we want to make sure that all the CO2 emissions are captured from international aviation, and one way of losing information might be from poor procedures inside of the operator. So if there are issues in terms of data collection, issues where to store the information, the operator should start thinking to improve these procedures and include information of its procedures in the emissions monitoring plan. In this section, the operator will also identify how it will communicate with the state when it comes to the changes in the emissions monitoring plan. So how often, what kind of changes the operator will communicate to the state, what is the channel of communication between the operator and the state. These are kind of things that will be included in the fourth section of the emissions monitoring plan. So we are turning towards the end of this presentation. I just wanted to conclude by talking about the review of the emissions monitoring plan and a little bit about the calculation of CO2 emissions. So everything that we have been talking as of now is an action for the operator. So airplane operator drafts the emissions monitoring plan. Airplane operator will identify appropriate monitoring method. Airplane operator will complete the emissions monitoring plan. But there is a role for the state, and that role is to review and approve the emissions monitoring plan. So again, the communication is key here. I think neither the operator nor the state wants to have any kind of surprises when it comes to the emissions monitoring plan. So especially now, when the operators are starting to prepare their initial emissions monitoring plans for the purposes of starting the monitoring from 1st of January 2019, there should be a clear and open communication channel between the operator and the state. We really want to avoid a scenario where operator drafts an emissions monitoring plan, sends it to the state, and then hears nothing about the emissions monitoring plan, or where the state takes very stringent options or stringent actions against the emissions monitoring plan without consulting the operator before that. State has the authority to review and approve, but especially for the beginning of the CORSIA, it's important to be on the same page and discuss between each other in order to make the emissions monitoring plan and then the subsequent monitoring of the CO2 emissions happen. I haven't been talking so much about the review of the emissions monitoring plan itself, but I want to refer to the Environmental Technical Manual, the ETM, that was already mentioned. This ETM will include guidance for the state on how to review the emissions monitoring plan. What are the key areas that the state should focus when it's reviewing and approving the emissions monitoring plans? This is basically a repetition from the timelines. So recommended timelines for the operator to submit an emissions monitoring plan end of September this year. For the state, the recommendation to approve the monitoring plan is end of November this year. So again, these timelines do happen during 2018 in order for the operator to have an approved emissions monitoring plan in place before the beginning of 2019. There are also mandatory timelines for the emissions monitoring plan that I already mentioned. What should also be noted here is that the new entrants should also submit an emissions monitoring plan to the state. So if there's a new operator coming under the applicability of CORSIA, that operator obviously needs to submit an emissions monitoring plan to the state. And the standard that was approved last week foresees a 3 months period for a new entrant operator to submit the emissions monitoring plan to the state for approval. There are some specific cases. So, for example, what happens if an operator doesn't have an approved emissions monitoring plan on 1st of January 2019, or if the operator that is supposed to apply one of these 5 fuel monitoring methods doesn't have sufficient information to apply one of the methods. So in these kind of specific cases, it is up to the state to approve interim measures. So for example, in the latter case where there's no information to apply fuel monitoring method, the state can approve the usage of ICAO CORSIA cert for a certain period of time to allow the operator to change its procedures so that the operator can collect all the necessary information for fuel monitoring method. I already talked about the revisions. It's important that the emissions monitoring plan is being kept up to date. So the emissions monitoring plan should always reflect the current situation inside of the operator. So of course, changes do happen, and that's why there are provisions on how to communicate the changes from the operator to the state. So the SARPS talks about a material change. So a material change is something more significant. So this is a change, for example, to a fuel use monitoring method. If the operator wants to change its approach to fuel use monitoring, then this is a material change, and this is a change that should be approved by the state. So the operator redrafts the emissions monitoring plan, submits the monitoring plan to the state, and state approves. Similar procedure than for the initial emissions monitoring plan. There are also more minor changes that don't necessarily require the approval from the state. So these minor changes can only be communicated from the operator to the state. For example, once a year, the operator can compile a list of updates, a list of minor updates to the monitoring plan, and then communicate this to the state. Doesn't necessarily need to be approved by the state. Of course, it is within the consideration of the state whether it wants to approve a revised monitoring plan or not after this kind of minor changes, but approval is not necessarily required as per the SARPs. Finally, we have now been talking about collection of fuel use information, but what happens once the operator has the knowledge about its fuel use? Okay, we need to calculate the CO2 emissions. CORSIA is all about CO2. So the provisions for calculation of CO2 emissions are also included in the SARPs. There is a simple formula on how to do this. So CO2 emissions equal the mass of fuel that has been monitored already, multiplied by a fuel conversion factor of a given fuel type. So mass of fuel multiplied by fuel conversion factor. So this flow chart illustrates this calculation. First, we take the fuel use, and then the fuel conversion factors are also described in the Annex 16, Volume 4. For the majority of cases, this will be 3.16. So this is the conversion factor for Jet A and Jet A1 fuel. 1 kilo, no, 1 kilo of Jet A will produce 3.16 kilos of CO2 emissions. There's also a factor for Jet B and aviation gasoline fuels. So these are really the fuel conversion factors that are being applied when we calculate CO2 emissions. And the end result will be monitored and reported CO2 emissions from international flights. You might wonder what happens for CORSIA eligible fuels or those fuels that are not, let's say, traditional kerosene. We will consider those fuels later on in the calculations. For the MRV purposes, we will apply, or the mass of fuel will include all aviation fuel at this stage. The claiming of benefits from certain types of fuels will follow later on in the process. But for the calculation of CO2 emissions, all fuels used within that operator will be combined, and the CO2 emissions will be calculated from that amount of fuel. And as mentioned, the information about how to report CO2 emissions will follow this afternoon. Also a word about the CORSIA eligible fuels. So if there is an operator that is using CORSIA eligible fuels, and here we refer to fuels that meet the CORSIA sustainability criteria, the benefits from these fuels will be claimed later on. So once the offsetting requirements for the operator are being calculated, the benefits from these kind of fuels will be claimed as part of the calculation of the offsetting requirements. But we will hear also about this later on. It's not, strictly speaking, covered by the MRV of CO2 emissions for this seminar. So claiming of benefits will take place, but not as a part of calculation of CO2 emissions within the MRV system. Here we have a very quick recap of the timelines for 2018. So of course those timelines for this year are recommendations. once we are waiting for the standard to become applicable from 1st of January 2019. So recommendations for emissions monitoring plans, recommendation for the state to submit to ICAO a list of operators attributed to that state, and then recommendation for ICAO to make the list of operators publicly available on the ICAO website. Here you can also see the compilation of the first mandatory actions starting in 2019. Obviously, the first one will be to start monitoring CO2 emissions from 1st of January 2019. And as you can see from the timeline, this is continuous action. It covers the whole year. So each and every flight operated during 2019 shall be monitored, or the CO2 emissions from those flights shall be monitored. There are also mandatory actions with regards of emissions monitoring plans. So if not already approved in 2018, then in 2019 there will be dates, and also for certain administrative aspects of CORSIA. All right, this brings me to the end of the presentation. As Jane already mentioned, there will be a practical demonstration of the emissions monitoring plan, but I would probably like to take a couple of questions before going there.
Thank you, Jonas. That was a very thorough and very detailed presentation, and I'm sure we will have some questions. Just as a recap, so the most important thing now is the discussion, is the connection between the states and the operators. Something we did not mention yet is that at the same time that we are working with our states here in ICAO to make them prepare to do their jobs, the IATA is working with their members, the airlines, the operators, to make sure that they are also ready to do their job. So that capacity building, etc., that we'll be talking tomorrow, we also invited IATA to tell you how they are doing their capacity building. But it's very important that both the state and the operator be prepared, and that both states and operators know that they have to enter into that dialogue. And the dialogue is to prepare the monitoring plan. So when Jonas said the role for the state is to review and approve, in fact, we are talking about discuss, review, and approve. Okay? So this discussion bit is very, very important. The monitoring methods for the field, they seem a little bit overwhelming. You have to breathe, look at them again, and see what's the difference. At a first glance, again, people say, come on, you give me different methods, there will be different results. How can we do that? Why one would be doing one or another? All of that was checked. All of that was calculated. It's not a one flight. It must seem different in one flight, in one operation. Remember that you're going to do on and on and on. So that first difference goes to the second one, and then it's not a difference anymore. Because if you have a line and you're going to repeat that process, there will be no difference. So we did a lot of studies comparing those methods, and they are equivalent. Okay? We can have more specific answers if you want to know the margin of errors, all of that we have. Okay? So be mindful. But it's usually the first doubt we have. When we were talking to the airlines, and that's where those methods came about. Remember when I opened the seminar that I said 100 years we have commercial aviation, right? 100 years we are collecting that information. 100 years we have airlines, no, some, not 100 years, but you know, many airlines have been doing that for a long time. They have collected their information under one of those methods, right? It would be very complicated for us to come today and say, hi, sweetie. You know, I know you have been collecting that information with thousands of flights, millions of flights for 50 years in your airline there. But can you change it next year because of CORSIA? Well, I think I would get a no as an answer. Because saying, hey, excuse me, we do that not just because of CORSIA. That's the method we chose for many reasons. So what did we do? We respected that. Remember the simple? Simple. We said, okay, there are different methods out there. It's very unfair to now just come and say, change everything, everybody one method. So if they are equivalent, and that was the study we did, it's fine. We can accept. But that is now when the state have to sit down with the airline, recognize their method, make sure that they will be reporting under that method, ensure the consistency. You see, that's the crucial part of it. So I wanted to do a little bit of intro before we would get your questions, because those are questions that we already are receiving. On that mark as well, see, we put so much effort in our frequent asked questions bit on the web, because we do share, we do cherish your questions. And if one has a question, that's probably the doubt of others. So we were very thorough in our frequent asked questions on the web, and you probably will find one of your questions there too. If not now, after, check, okay? I also see that a lot of people get anxious with the presentations. We always put our presentations after the seminar. But I can see people are already taking pictures. I better have them with me. Maybe they are not going to, we are going to post the presentations on the web. However, I just asked my staff to see if it's possible to put the presentation just after we see the presentation, you know, during the break and so on the web. Let's see if that's possible, guys. Please do, because people, I also get anxious when I go in the seminars and I want to see the presentation. I want to have that with me. So we are working on it, but you will have it, okay? It's, be with me. Okay, questions. I'll start 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5. Sir.
Okay, Guido Harling. Again, a question based on my experience with the European emission trading scheme, and it's a how-to question. So I understand that the monitoring plan has to be in Excel format submitted to you. Is this how you plan to continue? Because knowing from Europe, there are the competent authorities or the CAAs of Europe, they have developed own web front ends, and they have developed data transmission standards for monitoring plans and emission reports. Is this what you foresee as well?
Go for it then.
That is a very, sorry, very good question, because in order to apply a requirement, of course, there needs to be rules on how to do it. As of now, there's a recommendation to use a standardized Excel template that I'm about to show you as a practical demonstration after the questions. Of course, the state has the freedom to choose the appropriate way of communicating between the operator and the state. What ICAO provides is an Excel template for the emissions monitoring plan that all the states can use for the emissions monitoring plans. That template will include all the necessary information that needs to be included in the emissions monitoring plan. It will be a part of the ETM, of the Environment Technical Manual. So it is, the status of that template is guidance, but we really want to help states and provide this template for the states so that they can easily implement the emissions monitoring plans.
So following up from Jonas, it means the following. We do have a basic platform that we are going to share with you, which is not fully automated. Let's say it's not a system yet. It's our first glance. It's a template. Now, if a state wants to automate that and it's something easy to do with their airlines, go for it. As far as you comply with what is the template, discuss with your airline, and if you have means to do that right now, perfect. We will also be working to facilitate the life of our states, trying to automate those things as we go along. However, we have our specific rules for CORSIA, so make sure that when you automate it, it's CORSIA being automated. That's the important thing, okay? Thank you for the updates on the game.
Thank you.
We had to announce that before. I didn't want to interrupt again Jonas' presentation, but I'm quite pleased to inform 2-0. Firmino made the second score, so Brazil's in. Sorry, my colleagues from Mexico. You live in our hearts. Now you can support us moving forward. Okay, next question.
Okay, thanks to Neymar and Firmino, Brazil is through to the quarterfinal. Hope they go all the way. My question is on the verification process of all the information that comes from this emission monitoring plan for verification before being passed on to the CA. Who is going to certify, or who is responsible for certifying this, the verifiers or the agencies or whoever is going to go through those information from the operators to ensure that it pass all the tests before being handed over to the CA? And is ICAO going to provide states with a list of verifiers? And who is going to ensure that these verifiers understand what the requirements of CORSIA?
So we will have a presentation on verification, specifically addressing those issues. But let me just advance a little bit. So when Jonas was giving his presentation, he talked about a verification of the information. So to make sure that we have a robust scheme, the way we'll do things is the airline is going to provide a report to the state with their operations results, right? But there will be a third-party verifier that will also produce a report and send to state. So the state will have two things. We'll have the airline report, original report, and we'll have a report coming from a verifier. That we really hope it matches, right? So the state will do his own verification based already on the input from the airline and the input of the verifier that has already checked. So those verifiers, those guys, it's their job to verify. They are accredited verifiers. That's their bread and breath, okay? Like you're an engineer, you are a verifier. There's verifiers, and that's a regulated profession, okay? We are not the first one on Earth asking for inventories on CO2. We are not. That's already happening for a while out there. There's a lot of verifiers out there already trained, already getting their stamps as verifiers for CO2. That's not novelty. Many airlines, in fact, because they have their own voluntary offsetting, they have verifiers. Some other colleagues, because of regional schemes, also have verifiers, even for aviation CO2, right? So that's already happening, guys. Now, how does that happen? We are going to have a presentation, but how does that happen? We have an ISO, okay? It's an international standards for verifying CO2 emissions. That already exists. So if I'm a verifier, I am already certified ISO 14 whatever, okay? We are going to see all of that. But then there is this other bit, right? That's called CORSIA now. And those guys don't know this bit, and they are not certified to verify that bit if they don't know that bit. That's what we are working on now, okay? We are giving this extra bit of training to the verifiers. How we are going to do that? We are going to do that in detail, but there is, like an ICAO, there is an international organization for the verifiers. We are talking to them, okay, to make sure that that will happen. GATT is involved. GATT is our training group here in ICAO. They will be helping us to make sure that we will have the verifiers trained to verify. Now, bear with me. It's urgent to do that, but the state will only start to get those verified reports 1 year after the collection, which starts next year in January. So it's by the end of the year, then the airlines will prepare their reports, and then the verifiers can take a look at the report that they prepare, and then, so we do have still that time. Very pressing, but it's not novelty for them. That's why I wanted to say. And the difference for the aviation budget, but we have to train them, and you're correct. Yes, we will be asking our states as well to provide us the list of verifiers that they already have in the state, and we will share with our states. And, you know, one verifier from one state can do verification in another state. There is all of that. But we will cover that in detail. I just didn't want to leave your question in the air. Okay? So we will cover that in a later presentation. So no more questions on verifiers, please. Okay, next was in the back. Go ahead. Not verifiers, right?
No, not verifiers.
Okay, good.
I'm Jay Page, University of Toronto. You spoke quite a lot about new entrants, and I'm guessing that's due to the possibility of CORSIA being a barrier to entry. I'm just curious, in terms of monitoring, they have a 3-year exemption, or is that just for compliance?
Everybody reports. Go ahead.
Thank you for the question. So indeed, in the Assembly resolution that was adopted in 2016, there's an exemption from the compliance for 3 years. Right. In the standard that was just adopted, the MRV will start applying from the year after the new entrant exceeds the level of activity in the applicability of the CORSIA. So 3 years for the offsetting requirements, 1 year for the collection of CO2 emissions. So new entrant will start collecting emissions information before the new entrant needs to comply with the offsetting requirements.
So the first year is their baseline year then? That would be...
No, the baseline year, obviously, if the operator is a new entrant operator, the operator most likely will not perform flights in 2019 and 20. So I think that's where you're coming from. So the standard, as it's been written now, it doesn't determine the baseline for new entrants. Okay. This information is only needed later on, starting in 2030, once the individual growth factor kicks in the calculation of offsetting requirements. So it hasn't been determined as of now.
Okay. Thank you.
Tom Fodor from IATA. Thank you for the great presentation. It was very well presented. One question I have is related to the 5 monitoring methods. The chart you showed, it's very logical, but it assumes in the calculation that there is successive flights. One flight arrives, it departs. Do you have any recommendation if there is some maintenance action on the ground when suddenly the fuel uplift on the subsequent flight doesn't reflect the fuel burn on the previous flight?
Yes, thank you. That's also a very relevant question because as you are an expert in the operational perspective of an airline, it is indeed true that the airplane is not only performing flights after flights. There is maintenance. There are domestic flights, of course, in between that are not accounted in CORSIA, and so on and so forth. There are provisions, more specifically, which are outlined in Appendix 2 of the SARPs. But in this kind of cases, for the maintenance, for example, it depends on the fuel monitoring method that the operator is applying. So, for example, block off, block on method is rather straightforward. If there is a flight, there is always block off and block on. But for methods A and B, for example, it might be impossible to determine some of the fuel measurement points. So in these cases, we need to apply alternative fuel measurement points, and all those are being described in the Appendix 2 of the SARPs. I also want to mention there was a question during the coffee break about the fuel uplift method. So there was a question, what happens if there's no fuel uplift for the flight? This can also happen, as you might be aware. So the operator doesn't refuel before the next flight because it has already enough fuel in tanks from the previous flight. So in these kind of cases, the operator just simply distributes the original fuel uplift between the flights. So, for example, if there are 2 flights being flown with 1 fuel uplift, that fuel uplift will be distributed for those 2 flights based on the block hours. Block hours for the first flight and block hours for the second flight, the original fuel uplift will be distributed according to this ratio of block hours. So there are specific cases in the fuel monitoring methods where not all the data points are available. So in this kind of cases, we need to apply alternative data measurement points. But very good question.
Okay, we are approaching lunch. I will have those 2 questions and that's it, because otherwise it will be challenging for lunch. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. My name is Christian Patrickson from Stratcarbon, Chile. I'd like to ask you, because you presented a certain number of methods to calculate the fuel. Now, my question is, do you have a provision, for example, in the ETM about quality control and assurance? Because, well, maybe you have, I don't know, that's why I'm asking this question. The way you measure fuel, for example, the way you select emission factors, particularly if you are not going to use default factors and you are open to using local factors, that opens possibilities of, well, I don't want to use that word, but manipulating information, because obviously the operator has an incentive to try to report as low emissions as possible. So what kind of provisions do you have in the rule books that will be available, will be available in that terms, in those areas?
Okay. Okay, that's a very technical question, and our standard doesn't necessarily go into that level of details. But as you mentioned, the ETM, the guidance material, will include guidance on how to apply each of these fuel monitoring methods on a more detailed level. I'm not sure if it goes on the level of accuracies of different measurement equipment, for example, but I just want to highlight at this stage that in the emissions monitoring plan, the operator will describe the data measurement points to the states. The operator is kind of required to describe how it will apply the specific fuel monitoring method. And then it's up to the state to approve the usage of this method for that operator. Also, not directly linked to the monitoring plan, but more towards the reporting of emissions, the verifier needs to verify that the fuel monitoring method has been applied in accordance of the rules. So the verifier has responsibility also to double check that the monitoring method has been applied correctly. So I cannot answer to your question probably on the sufficient level of details, but yes, the ETM will include guidance on how to apply these methods. And and that hopefully helps the operators and states in understanding what these methods are all about.
As I mentioned before, we are very confident with the level of information that we have, that it's possible to be done. One thing that we did not mention clearly during the presentation so far, but the President mentioned this morning in his speech, is that different than other SARPs that we have done, we have tested this one. And we tested it with 7 states, 7 member states, different levels of development, different levels of aviation activity, 10 airlines within those states. And it was feasible to do, was considered simple, the time was okay, and they did not see, for example, an issue with applying monitoring, different monitoring methods in the different states. We compare notes. It seems extremely reasonable. If by implementing the SARPs and using those methods, anything is perceived not to be accurate as we need, we will increase the regulations and the guidance to make sure it addresses it as we go. Okay, I'll have the last question. Let me guess. Monitoring methods? No, I'm just kidding.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. This is Abdullah Amir from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I'm just asking about, does the IATA participating in this? So they might help us in the implementation of private companies, and they might help us to do the workshops for the private companies.
So I don't usually do that, but I'll reply on behalf of IATA. Yes, IATA is involved. IATA is part of the committee I just mentioned to you before. It's Committee on Aviation and Environmental Protection. IATA was an integral and very active part while we were developing the SARPs. And it was in straight discussions and cooperation with IATA that we came out with all those methods, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? Now, I would like very much to break for lunch right now, and I'll announce that Qatar has kindly sponsored our lunch today. It's waiting for us outside the room, and we will start at 2 p.m. sharp. You better be in the room, because otherwise you'll miss it. Thank you.